Prova, prova, prova. Gli faccio usare questo. Invece di far tutti quanti. Se no sto qua in coglione. Invece di metterglielo, di microfonare tutti, lascio acceso questo e può parlare qua. Non che vada molto bene questo qui, però dai, sono 4. Spoke here.
Okay.
Okay.
Test. Test.
Test.
Test.
O se no sto qua a microfonarli tutti. Forse è meglio. Sì, dai, lì microfono tutti.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Here. And now.
Quickly take your seats, please, those of you who are coming in. Well, my name is Mel Goodale, and it's my pleasure to chair the afternoon session. And we have a real treat for the first hour and a half, which is to listen to the best posters that were adjudicated in the submissions this year. We will ask each of the presenters to speak for 12 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion after that, and we'll end with coffee. So, Iris Grun from the NIMH, is going to talk to us today about comparing computational object and functional models of scene representation in the human brain. Iris.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I would like to thank the organizers for the award and for giving the opportunity to present my work here. So I will be talking about scene representation in the human brain. And in particular, I'll be focusing on how can we distinguish two different scenes and how these properties are represented in the human brain. And the particular focus will be on scene selective regions. So there are 3 regions in the brain that have been implicated in scene processing in particular: the parahippocampal place area, the occipital place area, and then also the retrosplenial complex, which we also like to refer to as the medial place area. And all these regions tend to activate more strongly to scenes than to isolated objects or faces, and therefore we think they are important for scene perception. But what we don't know really is what these regions represent. And if we think about how we can tell two different scenes apart, say this beach scene and this park scene, there's actually many different levels at which we can distinguish these scenes. For example, we can think about image statistics, like the edges and contours in an image, or the spatial frequencies, or the color distributions are all very different between these two scenes. We can think about the 3D structure. The one has an open layout, the other has a closed layout. There's differences in the distances towards salient objects in the scenes. There's differences in the objects themselves, the shapes, their density, their size, the semantics of the scene, of course, the object labels. And we can even go a little bit higher and think about maybe affordances of scenes, like the kinds of actions we can do in these scenes, or for example, navigational affordances, how can we move around in these scenes. And if we ask ourselves, well, which of these properties are important for scene representation in the human brain, I think that it's fair to say that the current state of the field is that all these properties matter. So all these properties are to some extent represented, and they all have some relevance for behavior. But what we're also starting to realize now as a field is that these properties also in the real world, they are correlated, of course. So that makes it more difficult to identify the contribution of each property itself. And just to illustrate that, I want to return to the beach scene and see, it's quite clear where that you can see because of the presence of the thin horizon line and homogeneous texture and the sky, this gives rise to this very specific spatial frequency spectrum, differences in distances and differences in object identities. And this means that you can use all of these properties equally well to predict the response to the beach scene in, say, a scene selective region. And this was indeed demonstrated last year by this excellent paper by Lescar et al. So how do we go about solving this problem then? Well, we can isolate and manipulate properties independently, so go into the scenes and create artificial scenes. But it's actually quite difficult to do, to control everything in complex scenes. And it's also, we can wonder, well, does it then generalize to the real world, where these things are inherently correlated? So an alternative approach that I'm going to present to you today is to use instead a broad sampling of large stimulus spaces, and then select subsets of scenes that maximally differentiate different properties, and then model these types of information simultaneously for the same scenes. And to explain this a little bit better, I will first turn to the study that was actually the inspiration for this experiment, which was published by Michelle Green, who's sitting here in the audience, who did a similar study in the behavioral domain. So what Michelle looked at is that she wanted to know which properties of scenes do we use for scene categorization. So she started out by first measuring, very large scale online experiment, how we group scenes together. So she presented many trials to many participants, showing two scenes side by side and asking what category is the scene and are these from the same category or not. And this allowed her to build basically a big ground truth measurement of how we conceptualize the world of scenes. And then she asked, well, which properties do participants use to categorize these scenes? So she considered 3 different models. One, an object model, so this is much like the semantic labels that I showed you in the cartoons earlier. A perceptual model, which was based on the latest iteration of computational models that allow us to automatically classify scenes in categories based on the visual features that they learn to represent. So this is a CNN model. And then the third model she considered was a function model. So this model was based on yet another behavioral experiment in which participants again saw there were many trials online, but they were shown only one scene at the time. And instead of categorizing them, participants had to check on a list of actions, which actions you can carry out in that scene. So you can imagine that a scene, a beach scene, you can swim and go running, but you cannot vacuum in a beach. So when Michelle did this, what did she find? Well, she looked at how does each of these models correlate with the behavioral categorization. And what she found was that actually all three models correlate with behavior, but the function model correlated the best. And I should mention that Michelle, you can see it at her poster as well, considered many other different models as well, but these were the three best ones. And then she also asked, well, which one of these, how much of the sort of variance is shared between these models and how much of each of these models uniquely contributes to the behavior. And then when she did this analysis, what she found was that indeed there's about a quarter of the overall variance that is explained by these models is shared. So you can take either model and you will explain that variance. But there was also a large chunk of variance, here depicted in blue, which was uniquely explained by these functions. So this was really sort of a discovery that these functions are really important for how we conceptualize and categorize scenes. So when I saw this, I was really excited, and I thought, well, how about the brain? Maybe these functions are also really relevant for representation in the human brain and in these scene selective regions. So what we did is that we followed this up with an Fmri study. But of course, in Fmri, we cannot use the large scale, we cannot use millions of trials, so we have to sub-select and select stimuli that we can use in the scanner. And we did this in such a way that we could maximally disentangle these different models. So that's really the key, how we were trying to get around this problem of the inherent correlations. So let me just show you sort of visually what that means. So these are the 30 scene categories that we had. And this is just one exemplar for each of them. And if you look at it like this, you think, well, that's a pretty arbitrary set of stimuli. But if I now group them according to their function, you can start to see these different clusters. So there's a cluster related to transportation, there's a cluster related to sports, there's a cluster related to operating machines, or to indoor social scenes. However, if I now group the same stimuli according to the CNN model, you get a very different organization. So now we get all the sort of green scenes are together, there's a rough distinction between indoor and outdoor scenes, and there's some outdoor scenes that are separated. And then the object model is again different. So here you clearly see that, for example, the underwater pool, it doesn't group with the sports, but it's by itself because it doesn't really have any objects in it except water. So that's how we selected these 30 stimuli, and then we showed them the participants in the 70 MRI scanner. We had 4 exemplars per category, 4 that were repeated several times. We used 2 different exemplar sets that were split across participants, and I'll get back to that later why that was important. We used an orthogonal fixation task. We did that because we didn't want to bias the participants to focusing, say, on objects or any other type of information in the scenes. We used a distance metric that is suitable for doing these sort of regression and correlational model analysis that we were wanting to do. And then we also had a behavioral task that we did after participants saw these images in the scanner. And the behavioral task I will quickly explain now. So this is the task that was also mentioned by the first speaker yesterday, which is called the inverse multidimensional scaling task. So participants basically see all the images on the screen, and they can drag and drop at their own speed these images inside the white circle. And we just instructed them to group them according to their similarity, whatever that means to you. So again, we didn't try to bias them to using either one of these models. We just wanted to see what kind of emerged. So if I do this, I get, for example, this organization. And then we can quantify the dissimilarity by looking at the distances in this space. So in terms of behavior, what did we find? So let me first pull up the predictions. So this is basically the matrix representation of the clusters that I just showed you. So here, this is a representation similarity matrix. So categories that are very similar in terms of their functions are depicted in cyan, and categories that are very different are depicted in red. And by design, the CNN model looks quite different, and then the object model also looks quite different. Now, what did we find in terms of behavior? So this is actually the observed behavior that we get with our sorting task. And I think you can just see by just looking at these data that we do get a nice correspondence with the function model. And this is indeed what we find if we correlate these matrices. So just like Michelle, we find a correlation with objects, CNN, and functions, but the functions actually have the highest correlation. It's just a little bit higher than the CNN in this case, but it does also nicely correlate with her original findings for the much larger set of stimuli. And for example, if you say, okay, for each participant, which one is really the maximum winning model, the functions really do best. So in that sense, we find the same as Michelle did. And again, also if we do that variation partitioning analysis, we do see a very similar result. So this is her original finding on the right. And then if we do this, we see a kind of a similar distribution. We get a little bit less shared variance by the models, which presumably is a result of the fact that we try to separate them by selecting these 30 categories. But again, we get this large, uniquely explained variance by the functions. Now, onto the brain, which is the novel data. So here are 3 models again. And now I can do, basically based on the multivoxel patterns in these scene selective regions, I can extract the dissimilarity and then compare these directly with these models. So this is what I get for the PPA, OPA, and the MPA. And I think it's, again, immediately visible here that we now do not get this nice correspondence with the functions. If anything, these 3 models, these results are a little bit of a mix between these 3 different models, and that's indeed, if we compute the correlations, that's what we find. So we get a significant correlation with all 3 of the models, but now this time the CNN actually has the highest correlation. Similar for the occipital place area, and actually we do not find any significant correlation in this medial surface region. We can do the variation partitioning, and then again a different picture emerges. We do get some unique variance by the functions and the objects, but most of the unique variance now is really in the CNN features. And similar for the occipital place area, and yeah, this is, we don't get any much explained variance here. So what have we found so far? Well, we found a replication of the results from Green et al. 2016. However, in the Fmri, we find a different pattern of results. It's dominated by the CNN, and we have a limited contribution of other models. So now there's a few questions we can ask about these data. Perhaps we find a different result because the results are not so generalizable. We, of course, subsampled the space. But remember that we had these 2 different exemplar sets, so this is what we use to try and see if these results actually replicated across participants and different stimuli. And so we can do that both in behavior and in the brain, and actually we do get quite a nice correlation between images from the same categories but different participants, different images in both the brain and the behavior, but there's less of a correspondence between them, just consistent with the fact that these 2 domains are better predicted by different models. How about depth of processing? Of course, we use this orthogonal task. Maybe participants just didn't engage enough with the stimuli. So we followed this up with the same experiment, but now participants were doing a covert naming task. However, the results were actually very similar. If anything, we got even more of a correlation with the CNN. So we did get an overall stronger correlation, but it was, again, mostly driven by the CNN features. Now, did we miss something? We've been focusing on these scene selective regions because that's what everybody thinks is most important for perception. How about if we do a searchlight across the whole brain? Well, first, if we look at where do we actually get correlation with behavior, consistent with the idea that these regions are really relevant for scene categorization behavior, we do get the peak correlations in the scene selective regions. So behavior is firmly correlated there. And the CNN, consistent with the ROI analysis, indeed shows the strongest correlations within these regions as well. However, for the function model, we actually see something a little bit different. So we do get some correlations within the perihippocampal place area, again, consistent with the ROI analysis. But now, to our surprise, we saw this a sort of a large correlation emerging on the left hemisphere, which we hadn't expected, and we were thinking in the direction of going to literature to findings of more conceptual knowledge or maybe generation of action verbs. And since yesterday, I now realized that actually maybe this may be really consistent with all the findings on action decoding. So I think this is actually a nice sort of thing that's falling out of our data that we are finding here. But in terms of what our hypotheses, we found that behavior and CNN model correlate with the scene selective regions, but the functions seem to be represented elsewhere. So to sum up, we found that scene categorization correlates best with functions, yet scene selective brain regions are best described by visual properties reflected in a computational CNN. At the same time, the behavior itself is reflected most strongly in the scene selective regions. So in that sense, it's a little bit of a puzzle that we try to disentangle these models, and indeed we get different results. One of them best predicts brain responses, but which correlate with behavior, but this behavior itself is best represented by functions. So there's clearly more to be done here, But I do want to bring home the point that doing these model comparisons is really crucial if you want to understand the unique contribution of each of these scene properties. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and all the my collaborators and the people from my lab.
Thank you, Iris. We have some time for questions.
Oh.
Well, it's one down here, and then we'll have Alfonso.
You got to sneak into the back of the room to get an early
exactly.
question, right? If you changed your task and it was something like judge the likelihood from 1 to 10 that you've been in a scene like this in the last year or something like that, do you think the picture would change in a dramatic way?
I think it might. Although we did, so like I said, we did have this follow-up experiment where we changed the task and it didn't really change much of the results. But we do...
as I understood it, you changed it to another way that basically was, in a sense, orthogonal to the scene perception. And I'm trying to make one that, you know, indirectly asks them to actually really engage with the scene.
Yeah, no, maybe I didn't explain that. So the covert naming was a naming of the scene category. So in that sense, it was supposed to engage them more with the stimuli, but it was still, just basically deriving a label for the scene. So it wasn't really like a memory task or something. And for example, this RSC or MPA region has been, and it's really now becoming more clear that in order to get that to engage, you need to have a task that's more memory-based or that's more really directed at navigation. So I think it might change sort of a subtle shift in which regions come online. But I'm not sure if it would change much about these other two regions in terms of how they represent this information.
We have a question up here, Alfonso. The microphone is coming.
Can you say a little bit more about the CNN model? I mean, what did you look at? What did you get using this model?
The CNN model, so this is, so we started this a little while ago, so we used what is called the AlexNet, so it's the 7-layer net that was trained on 1,000 ImageNet classes. Then we used one of the higher layers, because we thought that was sort of matched in terms of, you know, a higher level description, but they're directly related to the visual information, because that's what basically the nets can work with, right? They get basically the pixel input and they are trained to associate it to a label, but they are it's always visual what they're representing. And actually, so I have this additional slide which shows the results for all the other layers. This is not a setup. So after we found that the CNN just does so well, and this is really emerging now from multiple studies this year and recent years. So the CNN, so we do find that the highest layers actually have the strongest correlation with these regions, again in the perioccipital place area and occipital place area. But note that we do already get quite good correlations for quite low level layers in these CNNs as well, and it actually changes a little bit by regards to how you train these CNNs. So you can train it on objects, or you can train it on places. And you see that generally you get this sort of increase, but what I find really intriguing is with the place-trained CNN, we actually, you almost get no increase anymore after the third layer. So that's, in this occipital place area, it's actually going down with higher layers. So this suggests not only that representations are visual, but also that they might actually be more low level than we think they are. However, as I started out in the beginning, these layers are also all correlated with one another, right? So we really need to think carefully about how we can disentangle different types of information also in these CNNs. So this is all post hoc, testing more and more models, and of course that's very exciting, but it's not our original setup, was really based on these 3 different models that we hypothesized about.
Okay, I think we'll move on. Thank you very much, Iris.
Okay.
So our next talk is by Sushrat Tharat from CIMeC, right here in the hometown boy.
Okay, okay, it's working. So I'm going to talk about my work at the Palin lab regarding the use of convolutional networks to measure object animacy contributions in the brain. The basic debate starts here. So if you show animate stimuli and inanimate stimuli to human subjects, what you find is in the ventral temporal cortex, you have distinct neural representations for these two categories. Now, one of the big questions is what drives this categorization? Is it some visual features? So if you can see, the animate stimuli have object parts like legs or bodies or eyes, which would assist you in distinguishing them from inanimate objects. But it could also be something non-visual, such as agency. So we know that humans think, animals think, cars don't for now. So that could be something which is being used. So that's the main question which we want to address. So how do you address this? One thing which you could do is you create a stimuli set where you can shape match the stimuli so that you don't have any category information. You cannot infer any category information through visual features. And then you try to see if any category information is reflected in the brain. If it is, then the brain is using some sort of extra visual coding. That is what was done in Proclova 2016. They have a stimulus set of 16 objects which were shape matched. So you have the snake and you have the rope, which look similar but are from two different categories. To assess the visual similarity of these objects, an oddball detection task was used. So you have 15 distractors and one object, and the task is to detect that oddball. The longer you take, the more similar these two objects are. So you can then create pairwise similarity measures for each of the 16 objects and then project them into a two-dimensional space. So you get the two principal components. And what you find is there's no animacy reflected in these two dimensions, which says that, okay, this stimulus set is actually working, that it's not easy to infer category from the stimulus set. Now, what they did is they ran a searchlight analysis using the visual dissimilarity matrix, which we got from the oddball task, and the category dissimilarity matrix, which just says the element, correlation, the pairwise distance is 1 if they are from two different categories, as it regresses onto the neural dissimilarity matrix in each searchlight. Now, if the regression weight for the category dissimilarity matrix is significantly non-zero, we can say that that particular searchlight is encoding extravisual animacy. And what they found is they found this cluster in the ventral visual cortex, which we now call the extravisual animacy cluster, in which you can decode the animacy for these 16 shape match stimuli. So this raised a question as to, is animacy being reflected in this region without the use of visual features? And that's something which we would like to explore in our work. So as you can also see, if we run a support vector machine on top of this ROI, you find that the animacy organization drops out, and the classification accuracy is pretty high. And this is cross task. So we are training on localizers, and we are testing on the main experiment, which uses the 16 stimuli. So this region is actually encoding animacy. So to understand if the oddball task is actually capturing all visual features, we needed to go one step ahead. We needed to go to algorithms which could capture very rich visual features. And that is where we brought in the convolutional neural networks, of course. And so the networks we are using are designed for object categorization. So they are trained on 1,000 object categories on 1 million images. And what they do is they can identify that as an owl. So if you input the owl as an image, then you pass it through this convolutional neural network, which is a feed-forward system. And then at the end, you get the semantic label owl. So you can deconvolve these networks and try to figure out what kind of visual features have been represented. So in the first layers, you have features like edges and blobs, like Gabor filters. As you proceed through the CNN, you get mid-level features like textures, and then in the end layers, you go to object parts. So you have this really nice hierarchical processing going on in the convolutional neural network. And we would like to use these features now instead of the features we obtained from the oddball task to reassess the problem. So another thing of mention is we are not using AlexNet, which is the neural network which is used in most research nowadays. We are using VG16, which is a deeper convolutional network which has 16 layers. Also, all the representations in the convolutional network are visual in nature. They are not trained on any sort of semantics in the sense that they don't know that a cat is similar to it's more similar to a dog than a cat is to a car. They don't know that. They just think of everything as distinct objects. So whatever drops out of these networks is purely visual. So we can just use all the features out of the box. Now what we do is we need to understand if these networks can actually classify those 16 shape mass stimuli at all. Because now what we saw is you can't do that using the oddball task. But can these visual features help you classify those 16 shape mass stimuli? So we train each layer of the CNN using 72 images, which are different from the 16 shape mass stimuli. We train a support vector machine, so you have this animacy boundary, and then you test on the 16 shape mass stimuli. And the distance from the hyperplane, the decision hyperplane, to each of the stimuli is the SVM decision score, which I'll refer to in further slides. And the orthogonal dimension is the animacy dimension. So we train support vector machines on each of the CNN layers. So I'm showing the results here. What I'm showing are the rank orders of the SVM decision scores, so that it's simple to understand. So in the low-level layers, you don't really have high accuracy, of course, because they are encoding low-level features. But then as you proceed into mid-layers, you kind of see better accuracy, so it's like 63%, but not really high. But in the final layers, you do get full-blown classification. So the accuracy in FC7, which is like one of the fully connected layers, is 88%, which is comparable to what we find in the extra visual animacy cluster. So, okay, that's cool. We can use visual features to actually classify these 16 shape mass stimuli. But does the animacy organization reflected in convolutional networks actually match the animacy organization reflected in the extra visual animacy cortex? Because if it does, then we can make a stronger claim that, okay, the visual features actually can be used to create the animacy organization and not just distinguish between animate and inanimate stimuli. So we then compare the animacy organization between each layer of the CNN and from the extra visual animacy cortex cluster. So as you go deeper into the CNN, what we see here is the correlations between the animacy organizations increase and they become extremely high. They don't hit noise ceiling in any layer, but that's something we can discuss later. So here we visualize one of the layers which has the maximum correlation, and we find that the stimuli line up very well. So on the x-axis are the extra visual and cluster decision scores, and on the y-axis are the CNN decision scores. But we do find some differences which might have some structure to them. We don't know if they do yet. So the rope is misclassified as animate by the CNNs, while the plane is misclassified as animate by the extra visual animacy cluster. There might be structure to these differences which might hint at an extra visual animacy encoding, but that would require an explicit dissociation with CNN visual features in further work. So yeah, the conclusions we can make from this work is that the animacy organization for shape-matched objects in the ventral temporal cortex can be explained to a large extent by visual features. That does not imply that visual features are being used to encode this distinction, but who knows. Yeah, and the CNN visual features capture visual information beyond the behavioral measures. As we saw, like in the oddball task, you can't classify animacy, but in CNNs you can. And any further analysis where people want to make claims about extra visual encoding should try to explicitly decode the visual features obtained from CNNs from the factor of interest. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Alfonso.
Yeah.
Here, front.
Sorry.
Mr. Reliable.
I think very nice presentation. Can you go back one slide? No, the conclusion slide.
Oh, the conclusion.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
You say the animacy organization can be driven by visual features. What else? Is there an alternative hypothesis?
That it's driven by non-visual features. That's like agency, alternate. No, so the previous study made the conclusion, like the previous study concluded that you have extra visual animacy encoding. So this is a what-if study. If the oddball tasks actually show that, okay, there is extra visual animacy encoding, that conclusion should also hold if I use much more richer visual features. And it seems it does not to some extent. So that was the main point, but we can go further, much further, and just say that, okay, it's also majorly driven by visual features. I don't know.
The reason I ask my question is because there's been some rather confused claims about the organization of this part of the brain being driven by semantic properties.
Right.
And so I was wondering if that's what you meant. But if they are semantic properties, then how are those arrived at, if not through the visual stimulus that you present to the subjects? So, so I was curious whether in the back of your mind you were sort of leading us to say, well, it's visual and it's not semantic. I never thought that was a real hypothesis.
Well, even if we say that it's something non-visual, the problem is so these CNNs were not trained using any sort of semantics. But you can think about this in this way. If you have some non-visual information coming into this cluster, and if you have learning going on, your CNN or the network, the ventral stream, might get trained in such a way that you can extract those semantic features using purely visual features at some point. So it's like a chicken and egg problem. I don't know. So you have this feed-forward system first, which can give you some stuff. Then you can infer some other properties using a top-down and I don't know, processing. But then again, you can train your system to just do it feed-forward. I don't know how it works.
More questions? Oh yes, one over here.
Hello. Yeah, so everything here is about static things in the world, but basically one fundamental property of animate things is that they have self-generated motion or internally generated force that allows them to suddenly start moving when they aren't initially, right? And that's, babies pick up on this kind of animacy, it seems very early, and I don't know if they pick up on what objects look like that are animate versus inanimate early. So do you have thoughts on, like, why are we looking at animacy for static objects in the world and not the way that something moves in the world?
Okay. Well, you can also assign animacy to non-moving objects. And like you can also assign animacy to just snapshots of things, right? I agree that animacy is more, even to me, a dynamic property. But well, in that sort of analysis, I think you have to involve the dorsal stream too, because you're doing motion processing, but then you have to represent it at some place. So the claim is not that you don't have any non-visual encoding. It's more like using these stimuli, you don't need non-visual encoding. But you might as well, yes, have some motion-related properties there, but we can't anyway use, like, we can't capitalize on those features using static stimuli. Does that answer it? No.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Ok.
Oops. So the battery is about to die. Can I use someone's charger here because this one doesn't work? Thank you. I think so. Yeah, thanks. Okay. So I'm come from infant research, which means that you can watch funny videos for free. And I'm going to talk about infants' understanding of multiple agents in cooperative and competitive contexts. And the original idea of this okay, so the idea of this entire project comes from an attempt to look at the intersection of two fields that we know quite a lot about. One is Infantilological Representations. Those are representations about goal-directed actions, and we know that infants readily assign goal to things like just balls that move through obstacles if they see the goal and if the agents act rationally. So this is one area, and we know a lot about it, but virtually all of this evidence comes from testing one agent performing the action. And the second area is the fact that, well, in real life, most of the goals are pursued by more than one agent. People constantly do things together, they cooperate, and also we know that they're good at it, they're good at joint action and doing things together. So we decided to ask them, okay, so what do infants know about agents doing things together, pursuing the same goal? And so the question was, can infants evaluate and reason about actions performed by multiple agents, by more than just one agent? And if we think about it, the simplest, sorry, I go back. The simplest two scenarios of two agents pursuing the same goal is one, when they have the same goal and they want to attain it together. So it means that they cooperate over this goal, they would help each other, they would have a certain commitment. And the second option is that they just happen to have the same goal, but they have two individual goals, and in this case they would be forced to compete over this goal. And also this kind of different behavioral patterns would make differential predictions about how these agents would interact with each other later. So the questions were, are infants sensitive at all to these differential patterns of cooperation and competition? And if they do make this categorization, are they able to make further inferences about it? In particular, the inferences about the benefits from this goal. And here we assume that, again, if agents compete, then they don't have any they don't owe each other anything. So if one of them gets this goal, then okay, that's it. But if they cooperate, they have a certain commitment. And in this case, if they start this cooperation, which is a costly activity, they expect the benefits to outweigh the cost of this activity. But sometimes, and often in life, the benefits come much later than the cooperation. So we were thinking, okay, so what is the good way when we can have the cooperation and competition and the immediate benefit of this activity? And we thought food, namely the food which you have to chase down, the cooperative chase. And we thought that it was a good way to do this because infants are very sensitive to chase, so they understand chase very early on at 6 months. And also food sharing and resource transition is very important in traditional societies. So there's a good reasons to think that this thing is going to work. So we did this simple 2x2 designs, two groups of infants of 13 months. And one group sees, both of them see the chase scenario. So 2 chasers, 1 chasee, and one of them see chasers cooperating with each other, trying to help each other to catch the chasee. And the second group of infants sees chasers competing with each other, trying to prevent each other from catching the chasee. And then both of them see the same test phase, where they catch the chasee and they eat it, and they either share with each other or they don't. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. Will I? Okay. I'm sorry. I will have to change this. Okay. So they try to coordinate with each other. Then they talk, what do we do next? And they go around, they wait for each other, and then they go and try to catch it together. Okay? So on the opposite, when they compete, they don't try to help each other. In fact, they try to prevent each other from getting the chasee. And then instead of talking, they fight. And then they don't care about waiting for the partner or anything like that. Okay, so after that we show the test phase, and the test phase they either share. So one agent always catches the chasee first, and then he waits for the other because he's his partner, and they. So babies love it, okay? They're not shocked by it, they clap, they smile, they love it. Yeah, really. So that's one option. And then the second one, they don't share. The same thing, one arrives first, but then he just doesn't care and eats up the thing on his own. And then the second arrives and that's it, it's all gone. Okay, so the prediction would be that after seeing cooperation, they should expect that, okay, they're committed, so they expect the partners to share, because that would just make sense. On the other hand, if they competed, why on earth would he wait for the other who is his competitor? And this is exactly what we get. So in the after seeing the collaborative, this is a looking time. And infants, when they look longer at not sharing, so they are surprised if the cooperative partners do not share the benefit, and they are surprised when the competitor shares. And then we did the interaction and significant. Okay, so this was the basic result, and after that we just started to ask questions. Question number 1, is there a default preference for sharing or not sharing? Because, okay, we got this difference, but maybe babies just like seeing agents sharing because they think that people should just share with each other. And so we tried to get rid of setting up any expectation of cooperation or competition. And we did this. So we put away the chasee. So this is familiarization. And then we just have these 2 agents who just do something without any relation to each other. They just kind of dangle around in this scene for a while. Okay, and then we show the same test phase with either they eat together or they don't. And so do they have any preference? No, they don't. So they don't want them to share or not to share, they just don't care. Then people started to say things like, oh, but that wasn't cooperation, we'll have a joint action lab in the department, and joint action people started to say that the real cooperation is a joint action, so you should show them the joint action, maybe that was not cooperation at all. And then we were also interested, so was that something specific about these cues that we should, because we just kind of put everything we could think of about the cues of cooperation, but we didn't know what exactly worked, so we wanted to kind of separate things. And we did the joint action. This is the joint action. So they have to move things together because none of them can do it on his own. So he tries to move it, but it's just too heavy, he cannot. And then together, so this is a joint action. And then again, we show the same scenes of sharing and not sharing and see what do they think about this. Okay, and they do think that they should share. In fact, they think it much stronger. This is a very strong result, so they have a very strong expectation. Okay, so then we started to think that, so do they have to cooperate over this particular goal? So, because maybe we thought of this, that there could be two levels of this, something we call narrow scope and the wide scope hypothesis. Maybe it would make sense if people cooperate over long periods in time. They cooperate over different things, and they would still have kind of commitment for each other. And so maybe it's enough if they cooperate over something different, but they still would have to share with each other. Or maybe don't. Maybe it's really about this investment and then expecting the benefit from this particular activity. So what we did the same thing, but we took away the chasee. So now two agents, they go through the obstacles together. They can't do it on their own, and they help each other, but there is no chasee. So they're just going through obstacles. They're just moving things together. Okay. And this is the preliminary result. I have 21 babies. I have 3 babies to go. And there is a tendency, but it's not significant. So I really don't know, actually. It's even possible that with 3 babies it will go to significant level. And it's a rare case when both of the results would be interesting. So for now, preliminary, we go for this more narrow scope hypothesis that, okay, it has to be context specific. They cooperate over this particular goal and they expect the benefit from this particular goal. But then if they do something together, that does not imply that they owe each other. Okay, so this is what I have for now. Just to wrap up, so infants do care about agents cooperating or competing. They do differentiate these two patterns. They do expect agents to share or not share based on their cooperative or competitive relationship. They do not have default expectations that agents should just share by default. And preliminary, maybe this sharing is that the cooperation is context specific, so it has to be over a particular goal. But that's preliminary. I really don't know yet. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? There's one back there. Questions from the back. This is good.
Thank you for a very nice talk. I don't know the wider literature, but when I see results like this, I'm often skeptical about the rich interpretations. So what can you say about the strongest evidence that this is really about sharing and cooperation rather than us as observers looking at these events as adult observers? And to us, it's obvious that it's about sharing and cooperation, but how do we really know that we can infer from the looking at differences that it's really about what you say it's about?
But what else? What drives the difference then?
Well, to instantiate a sharing event, various perceptual properties have to be different about it. And so, I appreciate that it's a constant sort of issue with research where you have to instantiate sharing in some perceptual way, but not confound it with things that are not about sharing. So,
right, but I do get different results over the very same scene, which is perceptually the same. And if I put away the familiarization, which puts up the cooperation or competition, I do not get this result. So what drives this difference then, if not the familiarization?
So you're saying there are no perceptual confounds, there are no differences between the sharing and non-sharing?
There is.
Or the cooperation, no cooperation, familiarization conditions. The only difference is cooperation.
No, of course. Okay, of course. We always have this question whether it's a low level, something low level that drives the affect. Of course, there are perceptual differences, and this is part of the reason why I'm doing the second round of cooperation, which is perceptually completely different from the first cooperation, for instance. And I didn't do yet, but I also I'm in the process of doing the second competition, which is again completely different perceptually. And well, we never know for sure, but then also if it's something low level, then what it is so that we can control for it.
Sure.
So.
Okay.
I have a question. Can you contextualize it so that if you had, there were these blue balls that were chasing the small pink one, if you had green balls that were cooperative and red balls that weren't cooperative, and then you actually had a time difference, so the competitive ones were presented before the scenario with the sharing with the red ones, to show that it's not just some kind of priming thing, but they identify cooperation and competition with particular features of the
Right. So
individuals.
I would interpret this kind of thing as a group thing. So we have a group of cooperators who are blue and they just cooperate.
Right.
And we have green ones who are competitors and they just compete. And well, sure, we can induce this kind of,
Yeah, no,
it
I
will be
understand,
learning.
but I thought it would be interesting to present the green ones who are competitive first, then the cooperative ones who are blue, and then give a green scenario with sharing, or a blue scenario, to see whether or not it's simply the time between they last saw something cooperate, and then they look at sharing versus really making the attribution that it goes to those particular individuals.
We can do
That
that.
might be interesting to
Yeah,
do, I think.
yeah, I see, thank you.
Yes, over here, Susan. Microphone's on its way.
So Felix Warneken's studies with studying toddlers actually cooperating and sharing shows a lot of detailed expectations about how to share. So they are sensitive to whether they put in equal effort.
Yeah.
And so one way to answer, I mean, there are two answers to the skeptical question. Well, of course, there's always low-level perceptual features. Yeah, that's a point. It's not an interesting point unless you can suggest them, and then you can test for them, right? And some of the control studies she did are already tested for some of them. But there's no other way to do it than just to keep going. But one another way would be to show that there's more texture to what the expectations are. And so I wonder if you have any plans to go in that direction, to see, what about the details about the nature of the cooperation or the differing degrees of effort the two agents put in, and the nature of the distribution of the resources at the end. Would they show any nuanced expectations at that level of description?
Yeah, it was one of the, so I have like a queue of experiments that I have to run. And one of the experiments that I was thinking about is precisely that. So would the expectation of sharing and how much one should share depend on the effort that you'd put in? And then in particular, so what about free riders? who are kind of around while the other one does all the work, but he doesn't really do any work himself. So would he get the food, or would they think that it's fair? Yeah. And in fact, I'm convinced that infants do have these more fine-grained expectations. I'm convinced that they do. Yeah.
There's one last question down here.
Thanks. Yeah, just one question. Do you ever test whether the infants have, it's hard to describe this, I guess, but the cognitive capacity to understand the physics of what's happening, to understand the sharing? So, for example, there's a scene where there's two of them pushing the barrier away. And that's obvious for us as adults to understand, oh yeah, there's two, you need not enough force for one person, so the other person has to come along and apply more force, and more force equals more pressure, but that's actually a lot of sequences, and that's something that cognitively takes a long time for infants, humans to develop. Do you ever test that? And presumably that's a prerequisite for understanding that it's cooperation. You've got to understand two people are needed, and that's alone is quite a complex operation.
It is. It's true. I did not test for my particular scenes, but we do know that infants have quite sophisticated notion of the physical world and how things work physically in the world. And again, we can never know for sure how well they understand these particular movements, but we do have reasons to think that yes, they do, just judging by their sophisticated expectations and knowledge about how things work in the physical world.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And our last presentation. So our last presentation is by Yinwang, Disentangling Representations of Object Shape and Manipulation in Tool-Related Brain Regions.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present one of our recent research. And I'm going to talking about the object shape and manipulation representations in the tool-related networks. And it has been well established that the perception of tools activate a large lateralized cortical network, including frontal-parietal regions and occipital-temporal regions. And what are the exact roles of these regions in tool processing remains unclear. And so there's our evidences suggesting that functional dissociation between dorsal regions and ventral regions, with dorsal frontal parietal regions and the lateral occipital temporal cortex might implicated in computing action-related properties of tools, and the ventral occipital temporal regions were implicated in processing of object shapes. Well, for tools, the shapes and their ways of manipulation are highly correlated, and so it remains inconclusive what our shapes and ways of manipulation were separately represented in the two areas. So the aim of our study is to investigate, to disentangle these two properties in the tool network. And so what we do here is we use four particular tools, which are the corkscrew, the screwdriver, the shaver, and the paintbrush. and to form a 2x2 design with the corkscrew and the shaver with similar shape, and also these bottom two pairs are of similar shape, and the columns have the similar ways of manipulation. And we asked 21 college students to participate in our experiment, and they viewed blocks of pictures of these 4 tools and made a judgment about the pictures. And specifically for each block, there's 2 names presented at the very beginning, and then the followed by 7 pictures of these tools. And the participants were asked to judge whether there is any oddball item which is inconsistent to the name of the tools. And the reason why we use these 4 particular tools is that the 2 pairs with similar shapes, they have quite different ways of manipulation, and it's also true for the 2 pairs with similar manipulation. They are quite different in shapes. So this makes it possible for us to disentangle these 2 properties. And so to investigate the shape and manipulation properties, we compute the information index, which have been used in Marius, a paper of Marius in JN 2012. And then we computed the shape information as like the, we first extracted the activation pattern to each of the 4 tools in the regions we are interested in, and then we computed the neural similarities between all the pairs of tools, and then we compute the shape information and manipulation information. The shape information was computed as the differences between the mean correlations between 2 pairs with similar shapes and the mean correlations of the 2 pairs which are different in both dimensions, and similarly for the manipulation information. And to further controlling for the confounding effect, to further control for the confounding effect of one factor when investigating the other one, so we also collected behavior similarity ratings from an independent group of students. And here are the behavior results, and taken the investigation of manipulation information as example. When we investigate the manipulation information, sorry, I don't know why this happens. When we investigate the manipulation information, we want to make sure that the effect we observed was not driven by the shape similarity confounds. And so we tested the interested pairs for testing manipulation information, and we found that for these 4 pairs interested, the last pair, it has a significant shape confounding effect. So this pair was not entered into the further analysis to make sure that we observed the real motor manipulation information. And we did a similar analysis for the investigation of the shape effect, and we found there's no significant manipulation confounding effect, and so all of these pairs were entered into the further analysis. And here's come to the brain results. We first do the analysis in functionally defined 2 selective ROIs. We define these ROIs by contrasting tools with large non-manipulable objects, and we get results very inconsistent to the previous literature. And then shape information and motor information was computed for each ROI. And here's are the results. We can see that in the bilateral lateral occipital temporal cortex, there's are very significant shape effect in these regions, while there's no manipulation information observed. While in the bilateral superior parietal regions, as well as the left precentral regions, there's are both of these two effects observed. And in the left inferior frontal regions, we observed a trend of significance of the manipulation information, but not the shape information. We also did comparisons between the shape and manipulation information to examine the specificity of these ROIs, and we found that the bilateral LOTC regions show very high specificity to shapes, and the left inferior frontal regions, as well as the left superior frontal precentral regions, they showed a trend of manipulation specificity, but it does not reach the significance. And for other regions, these two properties are more comparable to each other. And we also did a whole brain searchlight analysis, and we found very similar results with the ROI analysis. We found that bilateral occipital temporal regions were very sensitive to shape information, and but there's no significant manipulation information observed, while the manipulation information was observed in the left precentral regions as well as in the right superior frontal and inferior frontal regions. Well, the comparison between the two properties in the whole brain also give similar results, and as in the RI analysis, we found that specificity of shape information in the bilateral occipital temporal regions and extending to some of the parietal regions, while manipulation information it's not survived from the multiple correction, but there's some trend of specificity of manipulation information in the right precentral regions. And to summarize, by carefully teasing apart shape and manipulation information, we found both dissociation and associations of these two properties in the brain, and with the bilateral occipital temporal regions represent strong shape information, but not manipulation information, while the parietal frontal regions show both shape and manipulation information, but the frontal regions seems exhibited a trend of more stronger manipulation information. And that's all of my speech, and I want to thank to Professor Chao Bi and our lab members, and especially Tonghe Zhuang, who is also here, who did conduct the experiment and do the data analysis. And thanks for your attention.
That was a really nice talk, thank you. Do you think it's possible that one reason you were able to get such strong dissociations of manipulation information and shape information is that the manipulations you studied were really arm movement manipulations and not hand postural manipulations? That is, from my work and other people's work, we know that there are shared representations for actions and objects in the so-called ventral stream, or the posterior temporal lobe, right? And so some kind of manipulation information is represented, whether it's motoric or not is a matter of great debate. But I think one reason you were able to get this strong dissociation is you used arm, wristing, and extension actions. What do you think?
Yes, I'm also curious about, like, I didn't find any manipulation information in the lateral occipital temporal regions, which has been implicated in, like.
And I think that might be why.
Yeah.
Because of the kind of manipulations you used.
I don't know, maybe, and I think maybe because the shape information is quite low level in this study, and so maybe it's overwhelmed, the manipulation information is overwhelmed by the shape information. It's also a possibility, and as you suggested, it may be like that. What we studied is very specific, like hand movement. Maybe there's other actions will suggest a different result.
Thanks. I was just wondering on the latter plot, the whole brain analysis, you're looking at the manipulation more than shape, I think, there. And I was just thinking that I understand, if you're trying to bring apart those two factors, why you would do that. But at the same time, it feels like it's a very specific, particular factor. And in reality, I can think of a lot of regions, sort of another contrast of interest may have been manipulation and shape, right? In the sense that there's going to be, by throwing out shape, by having it on the negative side of the contrast, you've got to sort of throwing out a lot of things. And I think a lot of relevant areas would have both manipulation and shape, and sort of contrasting them might not be a completely ecologically valid approach, I guess.
Yes, that's true. Thank you.
Am I allowed to comment on a question? Laurel's comment, Laurel's comment is not clear to me what led you to make the claim you're making, Laurel, because Stefania Bracci has shown in many experiments that in this part of the brain there is a correspondence, some kind of coactivation of both hands and therefore hand shapes and tools. That's not the same thing as action. That is the fact that hands have particular shapes and they have configurations that can grasp objects of a particular size is not the same thing as action. The issue here is whether you have action information. Now, it can be implicit in a hand shape associated with a tool, but that is an inference that is not available in the visual stimulus. So I'm not sure what the force of your question or comment is. The point that there's no, the fact that there's no action information in that part of the brain is not the same thing as there not being information about effectors. Now, those can be there, but not the same thing as action.
Actually, my comment really wasn't about action or not action, or about the format or the nature of the representation. It was actually about the body parts and the scale, the shape of the motion, perhaps. But so hand posture was not something that was explicitly that was used to as on the manipulation dimension. Hand posture per se was not the critical thing that determined whether the actions were similar or dissimilar. It was the it was the wrist twisting, right, or not, right? So my only comment was just that it's possible, had the study looked at postural similarity of the hand, that there would have been a lot more difficulty disentangling the shape and the
so-called action representation. And in fact, Stefania Bracci and Marius's work was very much what I was thinking of. So is that a little clearer? So you have to be very careful when you talk about manipulation. Manipulation, the study didn't show anything about manipulation per se. It just showed when the objects that, you were able to disentangle 2 dimensions, and then we infer what those dimensions were. Or we infer, in the behavioral sorting study, did people explicitly think about hand posture? Did they think about wrist posture, wrist movement? We don't know exactly how they determined the manipulation similarity, right?
When we asked the participants to rate the hand gestures when using these tools, and so and they gave these manipulation similarity results. So I think it's more related to like the hand gestures, and for the screwdriver and corkscrew, they are more like rotate. And for
that's not. I'm sorry. That we don't. That's not a hand posture. So the posture of the hand is the same. For the screwdriver and the corkscrew have a very similar hand position, and I'm sorry, a similar wrist rotation is what makes them similar, right?
Okay. Yes,
okay. I guess I'm to some of you who don't study this, it may sound like I'm splitting hairs, but the way you encode these things ends up being very important. We can talk later, but.
Unfortunately, we don't have 2 microtorches. Let's not appeal to authority. I study these things too, Laurel, and I think that your analysis is wrong. That is, the claim is here that she's not finding an effect of manipulation. Then you can split the hairs, as you say, into looking at those that involve the hand and those that involve the arm and so on. We already know from the work of Bracci and others that in fact in this area where you have tool effects, you also have hand effects and hand posture effects. That's known, but that is a claim about the hand. It is not a claim about function. And what she's testing is a very different hypothesis. She's saying, if you have a screwdriver, and a screwdriver has a particular function, is the function of the screwdriver that is driving this area? And what she's saying is no. It is not the function as such. The way in which a screwdriver works is that you have to do this kind of rotation and so on, and that is the motor element of the function of a screwdriver. So I don't see what you're objecting to. You're objecting to something she wasn't testing.
I think we should ask our questions to her, not to each other. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you can see the shapes in the stimuli, and you have to. In the scanner, there's no mention of shape or manipulation. You just have to. You're just judging. Are they both screwdrivers? Are they both whatever?
Yeah.
So you can see the shapes.
Yes.
And you might or might not think about how you manipulate them in this task, but you can't help see the shapes. So maybe the reason the effects of the shared manipulation are so much weaker, and you don't find any region that very significantly favors that over shape, just derives from the fact that your participants in this task aren't, they could think about the things that aspect of these tools. They are correlated with their function, but the function of a screwdriver is to put something in, and the function of a corkscrew is to take something out. So it's not the same function, right? It is the same. It is the same action.
Yes, that's right.
So one question is, I don't know this literature at all, but what if you try to do a classifier based on shared function at an abstract level, actual function, like putting something in or opening, right? Where there's lots of different ways you can open, lots of different motions you can use. If you're opening a box, you might use both hands, and if you're opening a cap, you use the same kind of rotation as. Do you find classifiers in tasks like this that are orthogonal to shape for other high-level? Why are the hypotheses so low level that you're testing here about how could be organizing this, namely shared sort of sensory motor things, as opposed to the actual semantic features of functions of artifacts?
Well, I admit that there's some, maybe there's some confounding effect that the low level, the shape effect was driven by very low level factors. Yeah.
The question is, what are the alternatives that one could look for?
Yeah, the reason I do this study to disentangle shape and manipulation is because that for tools, we know that the shape highly indicated the way of manipulation of the tools. So these two properties are highly correlated for tools. And for the two selective regions, which property is processed in these regions? And I'm interested in this. And so I studied whether these regions possessed like shape properties or or manipulation properties, maybe, and if there's a distinction, maybe it suggests that different two selective regions might be driven by different reasons. Yes, that's the reason why I did the research.
One last comment.
Just an observation that in terms of the manipulation similarities, they are actually partial. So, but because you do the screwdriver and the bottle opener, the first part is it is similar, but then the pulling out is not. So and by I think by asking similarity judgment, you are driving your subjects to pay attention to that part of the movement of the manipulation that is necessary but not sufficient for the function to perform.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
Thank you. You certainly had invoked the most controversial remarks before, so $4:30.